I'm creating my Wix site. You think you already have a stunning website? That's cool. You're welcome to skip or
This story happened a year ago. We lived in a townhouse in the suburbs. Pretty safe area. There had been some robberies a couple blocks away, but they weren't common, and I felt pretty safe walking home alone at night. So one weekend, my boyfriend's brother Marshall and his girlfriend Amy and her brother Curtis were visiting. We were all just gonna chill, have a couple drinks, play video games, and relax. My boyfriend had his LSATs, and after months of hard studying, he wanted to just relax before the exam. Unfortunately, I ended up getting very sick. It was the worst flu that I've ever had. Extremely high fever, nausea, headache, body aches, and all that good stuff. Of course I didn't want to stop my friends from having a good time, so they came over anyways, and I just stayed in my room. They went out to eat before they came over, so I was in bed alone, watching TV. I felt like I was dying. I slept on and off. At about 4 p.m., I heard the door open, and I figured they were back, but when I called out for my boyfriend, no one came. Even if he was there, he probably wouldn't have heard me, but I knew that he would come check on me as soon as he came back. So I assumed that I just heard something fall, or the neighbors were making noises. So I dismissed it and went back to sleep. I remember I was sleeping on my back, and in a deep sleep, I groggily opened my eyes and thought I saw a figure move across my room. I was so heavily medicated and so sick, I didn't even fully understand what had happened and what that meant. I saw the figure, but it didn't connect in my brain that I may have seen someone. And since it was pretty dark in the room, I think part of me just thought it was the TV. Finally, at around 7 p.m., everyone came back. They were loud. Amy, my boyfriend's brother's girlfriend, was very tipsy, and she's very fun when she's drunk, so there was lots of laughter. My boyfriend came in to check on me, just like I knew he would. He brought me soup. He sat and talked about his day as I ate it. I asked him to look in the basket under the bed to get the new bottle of aspirin. We had a full-sized bed, and I had one small basket under the bed where I kept extra pill bottles, toothbrushes, shaving cream, and stuff like that. I didn't know it right away, but thank God he looked under the bed. He put his head up and handed me the aspirin, but his facial expression had changed, like he lost all the color from his face. I didn't think much of it and said thank you. Come on, I'm gonna take you to the bathroom. He never stutters. I was out of it, but I remember picking up on it. I told him no, I really didn't have to pee, and I didn't feel like getting up. And then he said, "No, let's go. I don't want to have to climb back up the stairs just because you need to pee in 10 minutes. I remember feeling pretty hurt by his words, but I knew that he was right, since I just had soup and a bottle of water. He walked me downstairs, and I couldn't understand why we didn't just go to the bathroom upstairs. I think I was so sick, I just felt too exhausted to question it. He sat me down on the couch. What's going on? He took out his phone, and his hand was shaking. I asked what was wrong, and I will never forget how my heart sunk, and I felt like I couldn't breathe when he whispered, "There was someone under the bed." Amy laughed, so I laughed, thinking it was a prank. But it felt serious. My boyfriend's brother suggested we get out of the house, so we did. And as we were leaving, we heard a thud upstairs. We quickly left and drove away and then called the police. The police came and searched the house, but they didn't find anyone. He must have known that we suspected that he was there and then left. My boyfriend couldn't give any description, only that he saw some sneakers, but it was so dark, he didn't see a face or anything else. The scariest thing that still leaves me on edge is that the police found a knife under the bed. It was a small steak knife, very dull and rusty. There weren't any killings in the area, so my friends assumed that he just wanted a place to sleep. I'm not really sure how he got into our place, but I have some theories. I'm really proud of how my boyfriend handled everything. He's a calm and collected person, but I always assumed he wouldn't be that way in a crisis. I really hope that this person doesn't come around again. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, She was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they only had dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places that were listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house, and within 30 minutes, she received an email back with all the details and a time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrived, there was a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken. Use back door." Walking around the house, it looked nice, but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opened it. At first, Amanda thinks that she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and he was the landlord, and the occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off, but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven. Only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. No furniture. Nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping the lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room, and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walked down the hallway into the living room, she noticed the front door had a plank nailed across it. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's giving the guy her "thanks for showing me the place" bit, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and that she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door of the house. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random person parks outside in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers the phone. "Hey, are you here?" "Yeah, I'll come out from around the back and let you in." "Oh, it's great. You have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out the back door. She says that the guy just looked at her like he was very confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother everything. The cops were called, and they took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. When I was really little, my parents would let me stay up late on the weekends and watch TV until I fell asleep. I really loved these times, and I would stay up later than anybody else just because I could. Well, one night I was almost asleep on the couch when I heard a noise on our front porch. It was the sound of our old-fashioned porch swing moving back and forth. I was a little scared, so I crept toward the bay windows of my living room and peeked out towards the porch. Sitting on my front porch swing was an older woman, probably in her 50s, wearing nothing but a nightgown, covered in blood, and holding a huge kitchen knife. I flipped out immediately and ran screaming into my parents' room, but was too terrified to form words. My parents saw that I was upset, but when I finally was able to tell them what I saw, my dad got really angry and told me that it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I refused and kept crying and screaming until he had had enough and snatched my arm and dragged me towards the front door. To prove that there was nothing there, I kicked and screamed all the way trying to make him stop, but he kept pulling me. Finally, we got to the door. He unlocked it, swung it open, and said, "See, there's nothing To this day, I have never seen the look of fear and shock that was on his face when that woman turned and stared at both of us, and then slowly stood up with the knife. My dad slammed the door shut and got my mom to call the police while we went and got his gun. He went back to the door with a 12 gauge and cracked the door enough to stick the barrel out. He asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Somebody killed my husband, but it wasn't me." My dad told her that the police were coming, and she freaked out, grabbed the knife, and walked away. The police found her 15 minutes later, trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. I haven't slept in the living room since. My family has lived in rural Nebraska since they immigrated from Germany in the mid-1800s. Near the turn of the century, disease was pretty rampant in the homesteading area, and it killed off members of almost every family. When someone died from illness, time was of the essence in burying them, as not to let the virus spread from the deceased to the living. This meant no wake periods. So an aunt of some unknown number of greats preceding her relationship to me dies of some disease, and she gets buried in the family cemetery on the homestead. The dogs were very fond of her, so it wasn't too surprising that after the funeral, the two dogs stuck near her grave. The rest of the family began to think something of it, when a week and a half later, the dogs were still visiting her grave almost constantly. But they weren't just at the grave. They were visibly distressed, frantic, and often barking while there. This goes on for maybe 2 weeks when the family decides to check it out. They dig the casket up and open it. The deceased's hair has all been pulled out. Her fingers are raw and bloody and mangled. On the inside of the casket door, they can see deep scratches in the wood. She was comatose when they buried her, and she came to while underground, spending probably her last 5 or so days alive in a buried casket. Okay, so this happened to me last summer when I was back at my parents' house during the holidays. It was around 3 a.m., and I was in my room on my computer when I got a call from my sister. Now that was already a little bit weird, since my sister's room is just down the hallway from mine, and she could have just come to my room. I went to pick up, and the call ended as soon as I reached the phone. I figured that she wanted to speak with me, so I got up and went to her room. As soon as I reached her door, she started screaming that someone was in the room with her, so I busted in, and of course, nobody was there. After she stopped crying, she told me that she woke up and saw a dark shadow right next to her face, and that's when she screamed. So I told her that she called me. She tells me that her phone is not even in her room, and that she was sleeping. Sure enough, her phone is actually downstairs in her purse. The weird part is that I have the log of her call on my phone, but she doesn't. We never managed to make sense of this. My husband and I had just moved into a new house in a new state with our then 3-year-old. Naturally, I needed to go food shopping for pretty much everything. It was dark by the time I arrived home, and I could see, upstairs, in what is now our bedroom, what I was sure was my husband standing in the window. The light was on, so it was pretty easy to see that he was standing there. I needed help unloading the car, so I went straight inside and upstairs, only to find that no one was there. I came back downstairs to find him on the other side of the house, completely immersed in a video game. Clearly had been there the whole time, but I asked anyways, and sure enough, he hasn't been upstairs since I left. One Christmas, me and my son were at my parents' house celebrating. It was getting late. I told my son, who was about 5 at the time, "Let's get home and get you to bed before Santa goes to our house and has to leave because you're not asleep." We get home, and I'm getting our bags out of the car, and my son says, "Mama, shh, Santa is in our house." My blood froze. Our front curtains were open to show off our tree. So I asked him, "What did you see?" He said, "Santa peeking out the window at us." I took him to my neighbor's house and told them to call the cops if I'm not back in 5 minutes. The doors and windows were all locked, and no sign of anybody in the house. While at university, my friends and I ran out of booze. Hardly any shops were open this night because it was so late. So the only option was to walk the mile or so to the nearest 24-hour supermarket. Between the supermarket and the dorms that we lived in was just row after row of suburban houses which all looked the same. As we were walking down one road, we passed a field with a large campfire and some people riding horses around it. There were people playing musical instruments and general sounds of a good time going on. The horses and fire and the lanterns which were dotted about gave it a very old-fashioned feel. Maybe 5 minutes after passing the field, now walking past houses again, one of my friends commented on how weird and out of place that gathering of people had been. My other friend had been thinking exactly the same thing. So, curious, we turned around and walked back to find out exactly what was going on. There was nothing there. The people, the horses, they were not there. Just more houses. Even though we were absolutely certain that we were on the right road, as we had simply turned around, we walked up and down the neighboring roads too. We found nothing. We weren't drunk, though we had had some drinks, and so I've got absolutely no idea what happened that night. Me and my two buddies were on a night dive, hunting prawns. It was about 1 a.m., and we're a good 100 feet deep in the darkest black you could imagine. We used to do this thing on night dives where we would get in a circle, turn off our lights, and then stir up the water and watch the bioluminescence float around us like floating stars in a black, watery space. It was beautiful. Only this one time, we turn off our lights, stir up the water, and the water glows just enough to reveal a fourth person sitting in our circle. We were at a dive resort, so it wasn't so odd to see another diver. Only it was 1 a.m., and we had seen no one else prepping a dive at the dock. He was also alone, which was odd considering the dangerous conditions of a night dive in those waters. He had no fins or gloves. I don't know how he swam so well without fins, or didn't get hypothermia without boots or gloves. We wore dry suits because it was so cold, but this dude was in a wetsuit with exposed skin. We thought we saw a giant gash in one of his legs, so the three of us all notice him and we're too scared to move. I can hear my buddies panting in their rigs, and the guy just smiles, waves, and then swims away. Whenever you think you're alone and someone just shows up, like in an alley at night, it's weird. 100 feet underwater at night is terrifying. When I was like 13 years old, my mother dragged my younger sister and I on a Disney cruise. I won't lie, at first I was extremely pissed about going, but it actually was cool. Something crazy happened to me while on the trip though. One night my mom and sister were annoying the hell out of me, and I told my mom that I was going to the top deck to just look around. She told me to be careful and to come back in 20 minutes. I told her that I would, and when I got up to the top deck, I walked over to the railing and was looking down at the black ocean that was being cut through by our huge ship. As I was looking down, I saw what looked like a man that appeared to have fallen or something. He went by very fast and disappeared, but I thought I saw his arm come up at one point. And at the time, I even thought I heard him make a noise. I saw his face for a split second and he looked petrified, as I imagine you would be if you fell off of a cruise ship, and I started freaking out. I ran over to a woman and man that were talking and playing cards at a table nearby. They were wearing the ship's employee clothing, and I told them what I just saw. They both took it very seriously, and the man called for help on his radio. I explained to more employees, including the captain, what I saw, and they did an emergency passenger welfare check. My mom got called up to where I was, and a while later, they told me everyone on the ship was accounted for. They pretty much made me swear on my life that I was sure and that I wasn't lying. At the time I told them I was sure, and 11 years later now, I am just as sure I saw a man in that water. Working on a school report late at night in my ground-level bedroom, I glance up to look at my reflection in the glass of the window, and then I realize it's not my reflection. Someone else is staring at me through my window, and then they disappear. I shudder. It still gives me chills when I think about it. One night, my buddies and I were going for a midnight walk around the roads by the house that we were staying at. Since we were under 18, we could have gotten in trouble for being out past curfew, so we would hide behind trees or whatever we could when a car came by. One of my friends said, "Why are you guys hiding? No one is going to care or do anything." Well, the next vehicle passes, and everyone hides behind something but him, to prove a point. Shortly after that, the same vehicle, a red pickup truck, turns around up the road and heads back in our direction. This time, we all hid. We figured that they made a wrong turn or something. But no. Every few minutes the truck would pass by us as we hid, trying to find us. At one point, some guys got out of the truck with flashlights and were searching around the woods and the shrubs for us, but we were about 100 yards away from them. Eventually, we got back to the house, but they still drove up and down the road looking a few more times. Whether they were trying to scare some random kid they saw, or something worse, I'm not sure. One night, I was laying in bed, trying to get my daughter to go to sleep, but she was refusing to. As I was getting more annoyed and tired, I asked, "Why won't you go to sleep?" Her response was, "Because those two people are watching us," and pointed to the corner of the room where it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. Without making a noise, I removed her from her bed and slowly brought her into my room and locked the door. She never said anything like that again. Coming back home from my deployment, I stayed at my parents' house for a few weeks while my late grandmother, who was suffering from severe dementia, stayed in the room adjacent from mine. It was around 2 a.m. when I am awoken by a blood-curdling shriek that lasted for what felt like an eternity, but must have actually been about 30 seconds in just one breath. It turns out that my grandmother was sleepwalking, trying to enter my room, and slammed herself into the baby gate that we had for my dog. I honestly don't know what was more terrifying, hearing that shriek suddenly in the dead of night, or flicking on the dim ceiling lights and seeing her stare at me, face decrepit, mouth agape, and her eyes wide as can be. It makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. Whenever I remember this, I feel like it's a false memory because it's pretty weird, but this is how I remember it. We were walking through an old church that had taken on a lot of graffiti over the years, just exploring. Most everything had been dated, ranging from many years prior to just a few weeks. While walking through a hallway, someone noticed that the graffiti on the wall was dated for the next day. It freaked us out. In hindsight, someone probably just future dated it, and we coincidentally were there the day before. Maybe it was their intention to freak someone out, and if it was, it definitely worked. At an abandoned house a few miles away from my home, we found negatives of what seemed to be a woman lying at the base of the stairs in a nightgown. Several months later, upon returning with a friend, he spotted a pet prescription bottle. He had some friends at the local animal hospital, so he took it there and asked about the dog. The vet said that he indeed remembered the dog and the old lady who owned the property. He informed us that she took a tumble down the stairs and was left there for 2 days before someone finally found her dead. My friend still has the negatives. One of my favorite activities is exploring old, abandoned buildings. I've seen quite a few strange things during these trips, but one experience still creeps me out to this day. A few years ago, I found a long-forgotten water refinery through the help of online exploration communities and Google Earth. Although it's stupid, I always go to places for the first time alone, partly for the thrill, and partly because if something bad were to happen, I would feel terrible having brought someone else into that situation. So, I make plans to head there the next day after my classes let out. The day of the trip, I pack up my camera and water bottle and set off following my hand-drawn map. After an hour or two of biking, I finally arrive at the place, which luckily had an old bike path that dead-ended just past it. It was completely overtaken by vegetation with trees growing up, through, and around the buildings. Not to mention that the actual buildings were just disintegrating, with paint peeling off every wall and ceiling. I took my time, scouring each of the buildings, looking around for anything interesting. I found hundreds of broken windows, weird broken spheres, and some kind of giant oven. After an hour or two of successful exploring, I decided to head off happy with an SD card full of pictures. Soon after I pulled my bike back out through the hole in the fence that I entered and started biking away, I remembered that there was one last shot I wanted to get. I'm pretty insistent on getting the shots that I want, and I didn't know if I would ever come back. So I decided to just tough it out, ride back, and take the picture. As I was going back, I saw a lone man dressed in old clothes walking down the bike trail away from the dead end. I thought it was kind of a strange path for someone to take a walk on, and something in me said, "Don't let him see you go in there." I biked past him and gave him a slight head nod and figured that I would bike all the way to the end of the trail, turn around, and by the time I got back, he'd be gone, having continued in the opposite direction. I leisurely take my time. I get to the end and turn around, and as I head back toward the hole in the fence, I see him there, staring at me, and walking back toward the dead end from which he came. He had a happy look on his face, but it wasn't the kind of happiness that made me feel at ease in any way. The best way that I could describe it is he looked like that he had just been told a very dirty joke and was trying to contain it. I knew I had to do something as I was literally trapped between him and a dead end. I decided to play it cool once more, but be ready to drop everything and run if things got hairy. As I get closer and closer to him, I can see his facial expression clearer, and he is not someone I want to be in the same state with, let alone the same bike path. I'm silently cursing myself for going back for one picture as I slowly get closer. Finally, I'm about 20 feet away from him, and he calls out, "I sure would like a ride. It's so hot out. Mind if I jump on?" As soon as I hear this, I realize this is no longer my brain falsely interpreting something as creepy. I pick up speed and rush past him, putting as much space between us as I can. I now look behind me and see that he's once again turning around and following me. At this point, I bolt back to the road. Interestingly, I stop at a nearby gas station on the way home to get a refill on my Gatorade. I see a cop there and told him I just rode down the old bike path by this park. He looked at me, sort of bewildered as to why a person would ride out there, and he told me that he didn't recommend people go there, especially alone. This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I like to party, but these people were off the wall. And as such, there were a lot of people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess, not being careful, not locking doors, etc. It had a very isolated vibe, and anyone who was hanging around who wasn't college-aged immediately looked out of place and strange. One night, after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with two other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students, and when we partied, it was not your typical UCSB rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night, sleep on our furniture, or our beds, as the case may be. That night, my roommates had a few people over who I didn't know, and I saw that when I returned home, one of them had opted to sleep on the couch from the shadow that I saw there. I didn't turn on the light because I didn't want to wake them up. But as I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom, I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy to him. He was lying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into lying as still and rigid as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs, so quickly that it startled me. I could see his wide open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I'd startled him, or that he was drunk or maybe on some kind of stimulant and was unable to sleep, I just hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. The guy made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like somebody was drumming their fingers against the wood very quietly. I lay still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like someone scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and as hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I got my cell phone and texted my roommate because I was afraid to make a sound. I texted, "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text me back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommate to the same effect, covering all my bases. Keep in mind that the scratching has been going on at this point for a couple of minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel good. He also grabbed at the knob and jiggled it super forcefully. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I know it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously horrifying about being teased like this through the door. I know that he was trying to terrify me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was really messed up, and maybe the police needed to be called, and I wanted to tell my roommates, since it was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me, and he was scratching at my bedroom door." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said. "That guy that was sleeping on the couch," I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over," she said. "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while, and I had no clue where he had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging in the other end of the house where my roommates shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the locked bedroom door of my two roommates. As they screamed, the heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up brawling frat bros. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me the whole time. At one point, the banging stopped and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that the guy had slipped his fingers under my door and was just kind of wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which is my biggest regret about this situation. Since when I look back on it, it would have been really nice to just stomp the shit out of those fingers. When the cops rolled up, I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing. And then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gashes that he had made using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realize now that he was not trying to sleep or on drugs, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there, and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. This happened in my junior year of high school. One evening, my mother and stepfather had gone out to some event. Maybe it was an extended dinner or a concert. I can't remember. I had stayed home to work on a paper that was due the next day and spent the whole night working at the desk in my room. To give you a picture of the room, my desk faces a wall and sits next to a small window that's on the same wall, and from where I sit, my back faces my doorway. While I was working, I was wearing these great headphones that I had gotten for my birthday, the kind that are noise canceling. My parents left the house around 6 p.m., and the whole time they were gone, I sat at my desk, blasting music through my headphones and writing my essay. Occasionally, I would take breaks and watch the rain and lightning outside my window. I never left my desk. My parents returned around 11 p.m., and at some point late in the evening, I had removed my headphones. So when my parents came home, which was coincidentally just a few minutes after I had taken off the headphones, I clearly heard the garage door open, and my parents opened the door to the house. Seconds after I hear them enter, I hear my mother shout my name. "Adrian!" she screams. "What on earth happened in here?" Confused, I get out of my chair and start walking through the house to them. There's only a small hallway that separates my room from the living room. Due to my rush to figure out why my mother was yelling, I paid little attention to the hall and the house. After a few moments, I get to my parents. My mom looks really upset. "Was this you? Did you have friends over?" I look down. The carpet is ruined. It's covered in muddy footprints. I frantically explained to her that I have no idea how those got there, that I had spent the whole night at my desk working on my paper. I watch as her face goes from anger to confusion to fear. We realize that someone else must have entered the house. Quickly, we scan the footprints, trying to make sense of the situation. It only takes us a few moments to figure out where they start. Our back door, which was usually left unlocked. Then we notice something else. The footprints started at the back door, but there were no footprints exiting the back door. We hear something pounding through our house. We hear the front door get torn open and then slammed shut. We all run into the garage and lock the door. My mom starts shouting at the police through the phone, "Please come quickly. Someone has broken into our house." After what seems like hours, the police arrive. An officer stays with us in the garage as his partner goes through the house room by room. His partner tells us that it's safe to go back in, that there's no one in the house. Then she asks us a question. She asks us, "Whose room is down the hall to the left?" My parents look at me, and I tell the officer that it's mine. She asks us to follow her down the hall. As we go, it's easy to see that the footprints weave through my house from the back door. They go through the living room, through the small hallway, into my parents' room, which is down the hall to the right, and then turn around towards my room, and then stop in my doorway. Then the officer points at my door, which I had left open the whole night. On it, in black Sharpie, was written the following: 8:47, I see you. 8:53, you forgot to lock the back door. 8:59, you seem focused. 9:24, turn around. 9:47, look at me. 10:15, look at me. 10:37, look at me. 10:49, look at me. For nearly 2 hours, someone stood in my doorway watching me. To this day, I shudder to think about what would have happened if I had ever turned around and looked at them. I was homeless for a few years after I turned 18. Being homeless leaves you with a permanent feeling of anxiousness and a sliver of fear buried within you at all times. You expect anything. The main problem I had with being homeless was sleeping. I was getting enough money from working side jobs to not have to worry about food or clothes, but finding a suitable place to sleep was difficult. You always had to keep in mind being detected. Sleeping in the woods was uncomfortable, but the odds of a cop waking you up and trespassing you are slim. I drifted around sleeping in unconventional and uncomfortable areas for quite some time, before I discovered an abandoned church off a side road. The church was in pretty good condition, and it was hidden off a side road, so the odds of getting arrested for sleeping there were low. The pews were torn out, and the stained glass windows were murky, with dirt and dust. But there was a roof and 4 walls, and it wasn't infested with animals, so it was heaven. I brought a sleeping bag and some blankets, and I slept there for about a week while I was trying to save up money to get an apartment for once. After a week of sleeping there, I came back to the church after a day of working and settled down in my sleeping bag, ready to go to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a piano. 2 keys being hit repeatedly. My pulse instantly skyrocketed, and I grabbed the knife I kept on me at all times. I didn't even know there was a piano in the church. I slowly got up with the knife in my hand and started packing my things up. I was getting the hell out of there. As I slung my backpack over my shoulder, the sound of the piano cut off and was replaced by the sound of a door creaking open. Slowly, I froze again and stared out towards the altar where the sound was coming from. It was dark, and I didn't want to turn on the flashlight on my phone, so I stood there breathing heavily while I was willing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The door behind the altar was swinging open by itself. I tried opening it when I first discovered the church, but it was locked, and I didn't want to break it down. The door was swinging open, and beyond the door was an even pitcher black than the one I was currently experiencing. And I turned towards the main doors, content on getting out before I saw any more. As I turned, I heard the sound of the door swinging open be replaced by the sound of it slamming open violently, and suddenly, a plank of wood fell from the rafters in the ceiling and clattered loudly onto the floor, feet away from me. A groan like a mixture of a machine grinding to a halt and a man in pain emitted from the door behind me that slammed open and sent literal chills up my spine. I slammed my way out of the church and started running up the road. I looked behind me to see the front doors slowly shut by themselves. I never returned. My story may not be the most interesting story you've ever heard. It doesn't end in me seeing a ghost or an alien or anything of that nature. But it is real. Many years ago, I lived in Maine and would occasionally go camping by myself. On one of those occasions, I woke up late in the middle of the night at around 3 a.m. I was tossing and turning and couldn't sleep, so I just lay there listening to the woods. Then I heard a faint "hello." I was petrified. I felt so vulnerable in that tent. I never figured out who it was. The summer after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. I spent the night at the beach, watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, I got to my car and started driving down the highway. After a minute, there was an old Tahoe that started riding my tail and flashing its high beams. So I got up to about 60 in a 45, and they were still on my tail. I pulled off to the side road that my parents' cabin is off of, and they took the same turn. I thought this seemed weird, because there's only about 30 or 40 houses on this road. So I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end, but leads to a maintenance area for the golf course nearby. The truck was still following me. At this point, I was freaking out, because if I pulled into the house, they would know where we lived, and they were still very close behind me. I took a bunch of random turns, and the truck kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic, going through the intersection that gave me a few seconds of a head start. I pulled down a side street. I went up about 100 yards, and then turned off all my lights and waited. The truck slowly drove by the perpendicular street and kept going. I booked it home, pulled my car around the side away from the main road, and pulled every curtain in the cabin. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as hell that night. Years ago, in the early 90s, my boyfriend was driving me home, and we saw a man lying on the ground in the strangest position, kneeling with his head on the ground and bent at a sharp angle so that he faced the street. It was 2 a.m, and the man was covered in sweat, with his eyes open. We pulled over, and I hopped out of the car to check on this guy. His eyes were wide open, and he seemed like his face wasn't moving, but it really felt like he was pleading for help. He didn't respond at all when called out to him. No blinking. He had glassy eyes. I reached out to touch him, and he was ice cold. I'm sure he wasn't breathing. This was before cell phones, so I hopped back in the car and we sped back to my house to call 911. 10 minutes later, the police called back to ask for the cross streets again. Apparently, they arrived at the corner and there was nothing there. I verified that they had the right spot, and they said they would call back if they needed any more information. That was the last I ever heard about it. I checked the newspaper for the next few weeks, but we never found out anything else about that man in the road. This is a story that was told to me by my mother. She was home alone and was expecting a friend to come over. She wanted to take a shower, so she left a note on the front door that said, "I'm in the shower, come on in." While she was showering, she heard a knock on the bathroom door, and she said, "I'll be right out." When she got out of the shower, nobody was there, and a few minutes later, her friend pulled into the driveway. I often visit Walmart in the wee hours of the morning. One time, I was in at about 2 a.m. and noticed an elderly gentleman asleep on one of those mobility scooters at the entrance. When I left about 20 minutes later, he was still there. I thought it was a little odd that no one from the store had woken him up. I found out the next day that he had died and spent the better part of a day on display as a corpse at the entrance to Walmart. I'm a massage therapist. I work for myself and frequently go to clients' homes at night. Whenever I would have a new client, I would bring my boyfriend with me as kind of backup. So the new client's condo was in a really nice area in Arizona. It was around 8 p.m. when I arrived. I got out of the truck and grabbed my bag and started looking for the apartment, because this was one of those mega complexes, and of course, the numbers were barely visible. As I was walking around, I noticed that every light I walked by would start flickering really quickly. Like the light would be fine 1 minute, and as soon as I walked by it, it would start flickering. I felt like someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off and found the condo as quickly as possible. My session lasted about 90 minutes, and I packed up and headed back to the truck. Except it wasn't in the spot that my boyfriend had parked in previously. So I call him and he says that he's on his way, that something happened. I get in the truck when he arrives, and he is super pale, and his hands are shaking. I ask him what happened. He told me that as I was walking towards the apartments from the parking lot, he saw a girl behind me, walking in tandem with me, almost like a shadow. He said he put his head down to light his cigarette, and neither one of us were in his line of vision anymore. About halfway through his cigarette, he saw someone walk by the truck really quickly through the rearview mirror. He said it was the same girl. He was starting to feel a little freaked out, but nothing too bad. He said he turned on his headphones and leaned the seat back to take a nap, I guess, when he felt a thumping under his feet on the floorboard. He said he looked out into the parking lot and then saw the girl crawl out from under the hood of the truck, stand up, and then walk backwards away, looking at him the whole time, and then disappeared into the shadows of the opposite side of the parking lot awnings. So he peeled out and sat at the nearest gas station, which was right next door, for the rest of my appointment. I never went back to that particular client's home after that. A few years ago, I was awoken in the middle of the night by a phone call. I answered the phone, and I heard a woman's voice on the other end, crying. And then she whispered, "Help me." I looked at the screen, and the number was restricted. I heard more crying, and then a sudden scream. The scream was cut short, and the line disconnected. I've told this story to many people, and most of them say it was probably a prank call. I would have agreed, but the crying, it sounded so desperate, so real. I have no idea who it was. When I was a teen, I never had much of a rebellious side, but my parents didn't want me in their bathroom when they weren't home. They had a fantastic shower as compared to the leaky piece of crap that I was stuck with. We'd had a minor spat this particular morning, and they left to quote-unquote clear their heads. That meant it was time to use the fancy shower. I was alone, and they had been gone about a half an hour. Then, I suddenly hear my dad stomp into the bedroom. He slammed his keys down, checked the answering machine, and I knew that he had to have been pissed, so I called out, "My shower drain was leaking again. I'm sorry. I'll be out in a minute." And then, I heard him stomp over to the bathroom door and then stop. I called out to him, and he starts jiggling and turning the handle like crazy. The weird thing is, the door wasn't locked. So I stepped out of the shower quickly and wrapped a towel around me and began saying, "What the hell?" as I opened the door. I opened it while it was in mid-shake, watching the knob turn, and there was no one on the other side when the door opened. I ran through the apartment and saw that we still had a message on the machine, and the front door was still locked. My parents came home 2 hours later. I took in a puppy a few months ago. Her original owners weren't able to bond with her. They said that she was unresponsive and disobedient and didn't have the look that they wanted. I have no idea what they were talking about. She's the best behaved dog that I've ever known, and she's downright adorable. So I'm used to people stopping me in the street so they can pet her. Usually, people will ask before they touch her, Or at the very least, they'll say something like, "Oh my gosh, look at that dog," to let me know that they're obviously going to come over and say hi to her. I'm pretty much fine with that. What I'm not fine with is what happened on one of my earlier walks with her. I live in a tiny seaside town, and I like to take my dog on a tour of all the areas closest to the sea when I walk her. We'll walk along the beach, down the promenade, around the miniature lakes, and then back home. Probably not the smartest thing to do, the same route every day, but I've switched things up since this happened. We were at the final stage of our walk one evening, making a couple laps around the lakes, when we walked past a man. Now, a lot of old men gather there on a regular basis. I didn't think much of one dude sitting on a bench by the water. I told myself he was staring because my dog was cute. I just passed him by. Then, from behind me, I hear him say, "Sit." And my dog, who is much more obedient than her previous owners let on, sits down and looks up at me all happy and expecting a treat. I turn around and frown back at the guy, and I see that he's still seated on the bench, and quickly encourage my puppy to start walking again. We haven't gotten 5 feet further down the path before behind me I hear, "Sit," and my dog does. I turn around again, already glaring, and see that the man is now on his feet. I tell my dog to keep walking and try to get her to pick up the pace, trying to get over to the path that leads up to the main street. We're still nowhere near the path when the man yells, "Sit," and my dog does again. She's starting to look very confused, and I'm pretty much terrified at this point. He's coming over to us, and he's catching up fairly quickly. He's close enough that even without my glasses, I can tell that he's grinning. At that point, I had had enough. I forgot about getting to the path. I just scooped up my dog off the ground and ran straight up the hill to the side of us, and climbed over the little fence that separates the lakes from the street. I looked down. The man didn't follow, but stayed at the bottom of the hill, looking up at us. He was not smiling anymore. I had never seen him before, and haven't seen him since. And I really hope that it stays that way. I don't know exactly what his intentions were, but it seemed to me like he was using my dog's obedience to slow me down, to keep me from getting away from him. So I really doubt his intentions were good. I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. A few winters ago, I got a job as a security guard. My responsibilities were to guard the construction site of a 3-story industrial building that was in development. This was a super sweet job. All I had to do was be at the construction site between the hours of 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. I could sit in my truck the entire time, except for 2 different times that I was instructed to patrol the site. What I would do is get out of my truck and walk the perimeter of this site, and then go inside and shine my flashlight around. This obviously wasn't a hard task, but it was a bit creepy. It was pitch black around this site at night, and there were no working lights anywhere. Every time I patrolled, I was a bit creeped out, except for one evening, where the creepiness turned into straight up terror. The night was going by normally. I was watching YouTube videos and listening to music in my truck. The clock hit 1 a.m., and I was due to complete my second patrol through the site. The first patrol went by completely normal, and I had no reason to expect any different this time around. So I jumped out of the truck and started down the path that led around the site. I was shining my flashlight in front of me the whole time and saw nothing out of the ordinary. This trek around the site took the most time out of the patrol, and I'd say about 15 minutes after I began, I had circled all the way around and was back at my truck. At this time, I headed inside the building. My truck was parked in front of the building, and so I entered at the front door. The building was still being framed, and there were no doors installed anywhere, including the ones that led to the exterior. And that's the reason I was here, to make sure that nobody walked inside and stole any equipment or vandalized any part of it. As I walked inside, I heard something upstairs. It sounded like a shovel or something had fallen onto the floor, and so I hesitantly started up the stairs to investigate. I was a little bit spooked. What would I do if there was somebody up here messing around? I didn't have a gun or anything, just some pepper spray that the owners gave me. I reached the top of the stairs on the second floor, and I shined my flashlight around and didn't see anything suspicious. I walked around and eventually reached the front of the building, and that's when I looked down to my truck through the recently installed window. There was somebody sitting in my truck. He was sitting on the driver's side seat with his legs still hanging out of the truck facing me. I was just about to turn around and head back down to confront him when he suddenly looked up at me and waved. At that moment, I turned around and ran back to the stairs. I walked down them quickly and ran out of the building. I ran over to my truck, and the guy was no longer there. I got very nervous at this point and looked around with my flashlight. I saw nothing and decided to call my boss and let him know that there was a man here. As the phone was ringing, I searched my truck and saw that nothing was missing and everything was where I left it. My boss didn't answer, and so I left a very short message stating, "It's 1:22 a.m. and there is someone messing around the site, and I have not located him yet." I shined my light around like a madman searching for this potentially dangerous person, and thought it would be a better idea to get in my truck and drive slowly around the site. This didn't take long, and I didn't see anyone. I circled back to the front and parked my truck in the same exact spot that I was in before. I put the truck in park and called my boss again. I got no answer and got out of the truck once again. I stood next to my driver's side door and again shined the light around. I didn't see anyone. Then I shined the light up to the window that I had been at when I first noticed him and saw him standing in the same spot I was at, looking down at me. I realized my job was to stop people from messing around at this site, but this creeped me out so much. I got in my truck and waited until my boss eventually called back. He called the police, and an officer showed up there about an hour later. He went inside the building and looked around, but never found the guy. I didn't see him again that night, or any other night I was there. I have no idea who he was or why he was there. I left work late one night, later than usual. I was driving home when I unexpectedly ran into some construction going on, and I was forced to take a detour. I turned right onto a street I rarely ever drove on and haven't been on in years. The street took me into the downtown area of my city, and it wasn't a very nice place to be. Crime happened here all the time, and it made me nervous, especially because it was late and there were no other vehicles around. I stopped at a stop sign and apparently made a wrong turn because I looked around and noticed the detour signs were gone. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket sitting on the passenger seat in order to use GPS so I didn't get too lost, and to guide me home. As I was navigating my phone, I heard a noise outside. I looked up from my phone to see what it was. As I looked around, I spotted a woman about 30 yards from my car, in the parking lot of a convenience store that was now closed. She was standing off by the corner of the store where it was much darker. Right after I saw her, I noticed that she looked scared, and then almost immediately I saw a man reach out from the side of the building she was standing next to, grab her by the arm, and pull her out of sight. The woman had made a noise again. This scared me to death, and I wasn't sure what to do. My first thought was that he might have been trying to rob her. I was about to dial 911 on my cell phone when I realized he might be trying to do something worse. I'm not the toughest guy in the world, and I've only been in a couple fights in my life, but I'll be damned if this woman was going to be raped or killed while I was right here. So I take a deep breath and opened my car door. After I did this, I heard the woman again. It sounded like she was half screaming, half calling for help, but all her noise sounded muffled, like the man was covering her mouth. I walked around to the back of my car and started towards where she had disappeared out of sight. I walked fast, but tried to be as silent as possible. As I walked, her sounds were abruptly cut off, and I got scared. Scared of what I might see. Scared of what I might have to do. I reached the corner of the store and very slowly looked down into the dark side of the building. At first, I saw nothing, and so I moved closer. And that's when I saw them. I saw them both standing in the darkness, side by side, like statues. He wasn't touching her. She wasn't crying or screaming. And they weren't fighting. I realized quickly what was happening now. I immediately turned around and started a sprint back towards my car. As my feet hit the ground, I could hear that they were chasing me. I got to my car and threw the door open and got inside. I locked the door, and right after I did, they were both attempting to open the doors from both sides. I put my key in the ignition, started it, and stomped the pedal to the floor. I was so shaken up over what had just happened that I ran 2 stop signs right after. I drove home and never saw their faces up close. And you bet your ass I haven't been down that street since. I know someone from my childhood who used to work as a chef. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah had to prepare a dinner party for a politician, but she and her workmates had run out of some ingredients. And since she drove a motorcycle, she offered to rush to a nearby store that was a few miles away. The house they were working for was settled on a hill. Aside from a few houses, there weren't any stores or establishments in the area. The road was empty. There was no one around. Sarah finished the errand and began to drive back. She was halfway on her journey when she felt a weight push against her back. Startled, she glanced at her rearview mirror and saw an unfamiliar woman with matted hair sitting in the back of her motorcycle, smiling and staring directly at her. Sarah was so shocked she nearly lost control of her motorcycle. She concentrated as hard as she could and revved the accelerator as fast as it would go. She began cursing at the woman, telling her to get off the bike. As soon as Sarah could see the house in the distance, she heard the woman laugh, and suddenly her motorcycle felt lighter. She couldn't feel anything pressing up against her anymore. She dared to glance at her rearview mirror again, and thankfully, she saw no one. When she arrived at the house, she was trembling. She knew that she would sound delusional and possibly even gain a bad reputation at her job, but she told the people there about what she saw, and to her astonishment, a couple of the politician's security guards chuckled and told her that this was normal around here. Apparently, a few other motorists living in the area also endured the same encounter. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances, one along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up into the laundry room. When we were too busy or it's too late to walk our dog, we hook his collar onto a long line that's attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house so that he can use the bathroom. We used to do this from the door in our laundry room, but we had noticed the large step from the door to the ground had been taking a toll on his hips. As a result, we started letting him out through the front door instead, since the porch is much closer to the ground. This particular night, I was home alone with my dog, and it was around midnight when I decided to let him outside one last time before going to bed. I hook him up to his line, close the door, and lock it before heading into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was pretty routine, even if he used the bathroom quickly. He liked to walk around along the front and side of the house for a few minutes before coming back inside. As I'm putting away the dishes, I hear a scratch on the door. That's what my dog does when he wants to come in, so I head over to let him back inside. Since I've watched way too many scary movies, I always look through the door's peephole before opening it. Out of habit, I look to check that my dog is in front of the door. Instead, I see a man staring very intently at the door handle. I freeze with my hand on the door handle. I don't know how much time went by, but then I heard another scratch. This one louder than the last. This kind of wakes me up from my initial shock, and I run to grab my cell phone. I call my husband to tell him what's happening. He was very confused. I probably wasn't explaining the situation very well, but he says that he's heading home. This is when I realize my dog is still outside with this person. I head back to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check whether the stranger is still there. Just like before, he's standing there, head bowed, looking at the doorknob. I tiptoe over to the laundry room and slowly open the door as quietly as possible. I can't see my dog anywhere, and the side of my house is covered in gravel. I knew I couldn't step outside without making a lot of noise. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I go to the front door to keep an eye on the stranger and to get a better look at him. I considered calling the police, but I didn't feel that they would take me seriously since all this man was doing was standing in front of my house. I tried taking a picture of him with my cell phone, but my camera was only able to take pictures of the peephole and not the images behind the glass. All of a sudden, the man looks up directly at me. I swear he knew I was there. He glares at me and then opens his mouth to show this taunting, malicious grin. He stood there that way for a few seconds, and with that, he turns around and starts to walk down the street. I stay in the same place, almost expecting him to rush back and start pounding on the door. Luckily, my husband got back after a few minutes. He convinced me to call the police, and we went out looking for our dog. It turns out that this man had cut the end of the line connected to the pipe, and our dog decided this was a good time for him to explore my neighbor's backyard, which was where we found him. It's been 3 years since this happened. We've since moved to a new house, and the police weren't able to come up with any suspects. Ever since then, we take our dog on very long walks before the sun goes down. I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was off season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk to the ocean. It was in a huge, open field surrounded by a lush forest. In the background were limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. We spent the night around a campfire telling stories and eating. We're both pretty experienced backpackers, too. We are very diligent in ensuring we do not leave any trace of food by our sight. I have my dog with me, too. She was leashed around one of the few trees in the field on a long metal leash and full harness. It's a full moon, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. It was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooks my dog. Now, she is used to the woods, but I mean, she is flipping out, tugging hard on the leash, like she is desperate to escape. She pulls so hard that her harness snaps, and she goes bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lose my cool. I drop everything and bolt after her. I'm not thinking straight, running into the woods at night. My only concern was getting her, even if it meant risking my own safety. I rescue her. I find her curled up in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line. Otherwise, I would have been totally lost. I walk back carrying her, and my heart is pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. The thought now is still unbearable. I can feel her heart pounding too in my arms. She's terrified. I'm no longer in a great mood. We all head to bed in my tent, but my dog won't lay down. She refuses. Her ears are up, and she's staring intensely at the tent wall, as if she could see right through it, and she's tracking something. It takes a while for my nerves to calm down from my chase earlier. I'm working hard at deep breaths and reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. That my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon. Maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. Then I hear it, cackling, like a high-pitched laughter that is full of a disgusting type of joy, and it's coming from outside my tent. My senses go on high alert. My body tenses up so tightly, it's like I'm about to break in half. I can't even breathe. And then I hear more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away. It fills my ears, laughing and more laughing. It's loud, and it just sounds so wrong. I can't even bring myself to move to look at my friend. It's like my entire body has given up. The laughs are then followed up with blood-curdling screams. It honestly sounded like somebody was being murdered. It was full of panic and horror and sadness. Dear God, it could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. Finally, my friend says something. What? What the hell? I even begin to laugh a little because the situation was so intense and wild. I had no idea how else to react. I can't handle this, I say, and suggest that we bolt for the car. It's a mile away, so we decide to stay. We just listened to the laughter and screaming until it faded away. When it was over, I didn't bother going to bed. Camping with two friends, the middle of the night. All three of us inside a square tent, just chilling out, chatting. The lights are on. One side of the tent wall begins to cave inward, as if there's strong wind or something pushing on the side of the tent. Everyone freaks out, but I assume it's the wind. Chill out, guys. I proceed to jump up and punch the tent wall, but then I connect with something. A feeling of punching flesh is unmistakable. Now I freak out. What or who did I just punch through the tent wall? I eventually convince my friends it's the smartest idea to have a look outside the tent. But it's been 15 minutes, and by the time they agree, there's nothing out there. I was in my tent, and it was the middle of the night, perhaps 1 a.m., and I had woken up to go pee just like normal. I was about to unzip the tent when I heard a small scratching sound. I paused. It was a slow, deliberate, crunchy, digging sound. It was too rhythmic for an animal, so after making sure it wasn't my dad who was sharing the tent, I unzipped a corner of the door and peeked out. The moon was just bright enough for me to see a woman squatting right next to our little two-man tent, digging at the ground with her bare hands. My dad went and shined a flashlight on her and told her to go back to wherever she had made camp. The woman got up silently, leaving a 4-inch deep hole next to the tent, and started walking away. I went outside, went pee, and got back into my sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I was awoken again by a clattering sound of a person or an animal walking around where we had put our stuff. I looked outside again, and the woman was crouched low, walking around our stuff and looking at things the way a monkey would. My father stepped out of the tent, shined the flashlight on her again, and she faced him. He asked her to kindly leave our stuff alone, but she just stood there, dirty, but clearly not malnourished, staring at his light. He gave up and went back to the tent. Soon, we heard her digging again at her little hole, which was literally 6 inches and 2 pieces of thin nylon away from my head. I shouted for her to go away, and she ran away in an animalistic fashion and didn't return. I fell back asleep, and in the morning, our stuff was scattered, but nothing was missing. My husband and I were out of town on vacation. We were staying at this bed and breakfast in Vermont. It was in a pretty rural area, but very beautiful. The place appeared to be very old, with elderly folks managing it. They were so nice and pleasant. We arrived there about 7 o'clock, and were starving. The old man that showed us to our honeymoon suite room told us he would make us some supper. We told him he didn't have to, but we didn't fight him too much, since he genuinely seemed like he wanted to, and we really were starving. He made us some red potatoes and chicken fried steak with toast. After eating, we sat with him and his wife and talked. We asked questions about the place and how long they had worked there. They told us they owned the joint. They asked us where we were coming from and what the occasion was. They were so nice. In the middle of our conversation, we noticed a man exit the bathroom down the hall, which was visible from the side of the table we were sitting at, and stomp a few doors down to his room, or what I assumed it was. He seemed troubled, like he was upset, or maybe on drugs. He was making grunting noises. The elderly couple just smiled, and you could tell they felt very uncomfortable, like they were familiar with this man and were just dealing with him. I wanted to ask about him, but I didn't. I felt like I'd be making it worse and making them more uncomfortable. Later that night, my husband and I were in our room laying in bed talking, when in the room next to ours, we heard a very faint voice say, "Not again." It sounded like a man to me, but my husband said to him it sounded like a woman's voice. Then we heard what sounded like a big piece of furniture being moved around the room. A few hours passed, and we were asleep. When I was shaken awake by my husband, I was startled, and he said he heard somebody gasp in the room next door and make a noise that sounded like they were in some kind of trouble. He said it was not the room that we heard the noise earlier, but the other side of our room. I told him he should call the front desk or the living room and tell whoever would be working there. He did, but very strangely, nobody picked up the phone. He put some clothes on and went down to the front of the building where we met the elderly couple from before. He was gone for about 10 minutes and then returned and said nobody was down there. He said he walked into the back kitchen around the outside of the house and never saw anyone. I'd say about 20 minutes after he returned to our room, we heard somebody walking in the hallway. They eventually walked up to our room and then stopped. Thankfully, the door was locked because whoever it was tried opening it. My husband yelled out, "Occupied," in a stern, annoyed voice. The person at the door then continued walking towards the staircase. We eventually went back to sleep and woke up at around 9 a.m. We packed up our stuff and went down to the front expecting to see the elderly couple, but what we found instead was very troubling. We walked into the back kitchen once again, and laying in the sink were white rags that looked like they had blood on them. We continued to look around, and eventually my husband opened a closet and found a mop bucket, and inside the bucket was very thick-looking red water. At that point, I freaked out. I knew something was very wrong. We walked around the whole place and never saw anyone again. Eventually, we left some money on the back kitchen counter and a note, and left. The rest of our vacation was normal, I guess you could say, but when we hit our next stop, we called the police and told them that they should check out that bed and breakfast. They told us they would, but we never got a call back. We never found out what happened until we got home. A few days after we arrived at our house, police were at our door questioning us about our stay at that bed and breakfast. We were told that the elderly couple were brutally murdered and their bodies were dismembered. The woman was found in the room next to ours, chopped up, and her husband was found in the room on the other side. His body had been dragged to the bathroom, and his body had been cut up in the bathtub. I was sick upon hearing this. We had to go take a polygraph test, but our story and willingness to cooperate excluded us from possible suspects. Months passed, and I would often inquire about it and call the police, asking if they had found who did it. Eventually, they had. We learned that the man that was staying at the place, the one that walked out of the bathroom that night, had committed the crimes. We haven't gone on vacation since. My childhood was filled with terrible and horrifying incidents, one of which takes the cake. My parents split up when I was very young, and I lived with my father. We lived in the middle of nowhere, except there were a few people that lived on our street. The street was really long and lonely. We lived towards the end of the street, and in the middle of the street was a woman. I thought she was really weird. She lived in a trailer, and once, when I walked by, she tried to sell me some candy. I was with a neighbor boy, so I didn't feel scared or anything. I told her I didn't have any money for it, and she laughed when I told her that. Like I said, She was really weird. What's even weirder is that my father started dating this woman sometime after we moved in. She never came to our house, but occasionally my father would go to hers. So living on this street was weird in itself. It seemed like weird or bad things would constantly happen. Unusual people would drive down the road and throw parties where they would light a tree on fire with gasoline. It really seemed like everyone living on this street was really weird, except me and my father. I always wondered what my father saw in that weird woman that lived down the street, but was too young to really put it together. One night, shit at my house became a horror movie. I was in my room playing with God knows what when my bedroom light turned off. I got up and opened my door. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I called out for my father. He didn't respond to me. I was confused because we had just eaten dinner together not an hour earlier in the dining room downstairs. I called out again, but heard nothing in return. I went downstairs and outside and saw a police car drive by and stop at our neighbor's house. I stood on the porch and just watched when my father suddenly surprised me from behind. He told me we needed to go inside. When we got back in the house, my father was frantic and telling me we need to hide, that somebody hurt his girlfriend, the weird woman I was talking about, and was coming down the street towards our house. This scared me, and I of course agreed to hide. We went upstairs and into the spare room next to mine. It was dark outside, and all the lights were out. I told him they went out, but he seemed to ignore me. He tried to turn the light on, but it didn't work. He sweared, and then he told me to get down on the ground. He told me he could hear somebody coming up our stairs. I started to tear up and was very frightened now. He told me then that he was going to go confront the person in our house, and he wanted me to stay put. I asked him to stay over and over again, but he insisted. Leaving me crying on the floor, he got up and walked out of the room. It felt like an eternity passed, and I heard nothing. Then I heard something. I heard the floorboards by my bedroom door creak, as if somebody was standing there. I froze up, terrified. I was too scared to even call for my father, which I desperately wanted to do. Then I heard the person run down the hall and down the stairs. I remembered that our old house was built in such a way that you could walk around the roof of the second story and enter the bedrooms through the windows. I turned and looked outside and saw only darkness. I decided to open the window and climb out. I moved around the window where I was out of sight and sat there in the dark for a time. After waiting for a few minutes, I finally made the choice to jump down to the first story roof and then jump down again to the ground. I did, but I hurt my ankle in the process. I sat right where I landed, rubbing my ankle, and the scariest thing that has ever happened, somebody standing about 5 feet away started walking in my direction. I looked up to see a figure in the darkness standing there, obviously looking at me. They didn't move. I did, however. I got up and ran up the driveway to the street and over to my neighbor's house. There was a bunch of stuff going on. People were walking around, panicked. The police had come and asked everyone questions, and they told me they had come to our house too, but nobody answered the door. I asked my neighbor to take me to my house to get my father, but they just said no every time I asked. Very late that night, the police came again and dropped a bombshell on me and my neighbor. My father was found in the back pasture and was arrested for murder. He had killed his girlfriend, that weird woman down the street, and was trying to pretend like somebody else was in our house. He was sentenced to 12 to 20 years for second-degree murder, and I've kept in contact with him. I've asked him many times why he left the room I was in that night, why he ran around the house trying to scare me, and pretended to be someone else. and he would just always say he didn't know. I was camping in Lake Tahoe as a teenager. The usual trip my family took. We would hike, and usually my dad would take the boat up to the lake. This one particular trip, we had heard from a park employee that a little boy had gone missing. Everyone was looking for him. Myself, my brother, and my dad all went to look as well. We looked for a few hours, but didn't find him or any trace of him. We left the next day, and we didn't find out if the boy was found or not. The very next year we went back to the same place, and on our first day camping, we went for a hike. On the trail, I walked out into the trees to go pee. That's when I saw a little blue shirt a few feet away hanging on a tree branch. It didn't click with me at first, but when it did, I returned to the trail and told my dad. He went out and looked, and when we got back to our camper, he drove off in his truck to go tell someone. When my dad returned, he said that he was told that the boy that went missing was wearing a blue polo shirt. This sent chills down my spine. The next day, we went on the same trail, and I went back to where I found the shirt. It was gone. The one and only time I ever went camping with my boyfriend, something crazy happened. It was a popular campsite, and there were many people there when we were. It was in the middle of summer. At some point, we decided to go skinny dipping in the river that wasn't too far after the sun went down. We walked down to the river, and as we expected, nobody was there. While we were messing around in the water, and again, let me remind you, we were not wearing anything, a man appears out of nowhere and is standing in the sand looking at us. I was terrified because the creepy man just stood there. My boyfriend asked him if everything was okay, and I could hear in his voice that he was scared. The man ignored his question and then started walking into the water towards us. I can't tell you what this was like to where you would understand. It was ridiculous, right out of a scary movie. We both started swimming across the river to the other side. We didn't want this creep to get to us. We made it to the other side and saw that he was very close. Naked, not caring, we ran into the trees and up to the campsite on the other side of the river. Luckily, it was very dark and nobody saw us. We ran into a bathroom that was connected to the campsite and just stood there, shivering and asking ourselves if this shit was actually happening. Eventually, we went back to the river and saw that the man was gone. We swam back across. We reached the other side and saw that our clothes and phones were gone. We went back up to the path to our tent and lucked out again. Nobody ever saw us, except that creep. We got dressed and drove up to the office to explain that somebody stole our stuff, but we had to lie and say that it happened during the day because obviously skinny dipping was not allowed. We never saw the clothes or our phones again. What the hell was that guy doing, walking into the river towards us? Your guess is as good as mine.
I am a United States Postal Service carrier. Something very weird and creepy happened to me a few weeks ago on my route. I've been carrying mail for 4 years now, and have had this route for about 2 years. It's a decent area to deliver mail, and I've never really had a problem with it, compared to other bad areas around my city that I unfortunately have had to deliver in. Some carriers have to deliver in shady neighborhoods every single day, so I do feel I got lucky with mine. I always go to this one specific park in the middle of my route to eat lunch every day. There's never really too many people there when I am, but this day, there were 2 little girls playing on the playground. This park was a pretty good size, and the playground was surrounded by pathways, beautiful flowers, and even a few fountains. The 2 girls showed up to the playground after I sat down at the picnic area about 20 minutes before. They were doing their thing, and I was texting my girlfriend and watching videos on my phone, when out of nowhere this guy comes up behind me and says in a stern voice, "You better get out of here, or I will call the police, you damn pervert." I was shocked and literally speechless. I spun around to look at him, and he was huge, probably around 300 pounds, balding and wearing old-looking glasses. I couldn't think of what to say before he spoke again. He said, "Get out of here, or I will beat the hell out of you." My face turning red with fear, I finally replied, "I'm just eating my lunch, man. I'm not sure what the problem is." The man huffed at me and turned around and started walking away down the path. I sat there in awe for a few seconds, and then looked at my phone to check the time. I had 5 minutes left of lunch. I texted my girlfriend about the huge guy, and then I looked over to the playground. I saw the 2 girls standing on the top of a big wooden slide, and I saw the man standing below them. He was talking to them. My first thought was that he was their parent or something, and got pissed and paranoid when he saw me eating lunch. But then I saw him reach up and try to grab one of the girl's ankles. The girl let out a brief scream, and I stood up. The man turned in all directions, looking for people who might have seen it. Well, he must have forgotten that I was there, or maybe he assumed I was still facing the other way eating. I have no idea. I started walking over to them after seeing that. I got close, and I could see the girls looked terrified. I shouted over to them, "Hey, do you guys know this man?" The man turned around and had a very scared but angry look on his face. The girls both said in unison, "No." The man started walking away immediately after that, and I just stood there and watched. After he walked out of the front gate of the park, I asked the girls if they had a phone and could call somebody to come get them. One of the girls did, and called somebody. I'm not sure who. I waited there until I saw an older woman enter the park. She walked over to us and asked what was happening. I told her everything, and she didn't really react like I thought she would. She seemed annoyed or something, actually. Like, annoyed at the girls. She told them to get down and that they were leaving. After the 3 of them left the park, I checked my phone again and I was 35 minutes behind schedule. So I quickly walked out of the park and turned to go down the sidewalk towards my truck. I got to my truck, unlocked it, and got inside. I started the engine and started driving. A few blocks down that same street, I saw the man sitting in a small red car. He was glaring at me as I drove by. I immediately got my phone out and called my boss. I told him everything I saw, and he said he would call the cops. The rest of my shift I thought about that guy, and I felt bad for leaving. When I got back to the office, my boss told me he did call the police, and that they went over to the park. I really hope he did, and that they caught that guy. I haven't seen him or the girls there since. I am in my 30s now, but when I was 11 years old, I had a frightening experience with a mailman. I was at the kitchen table with my mom, and we were making cookies and brownies. We were mixing things, and my mom said that she didn't have enough eggs for what we were making. She washed her hands and told me she was going to run to the store, and she'd be right back. I stayed there at the table, sitting in the wooden chair, watching the TV that was on in the living room next to me. I'm not sure how long after my mom had left, the mailman appeared at the kitchen door and tried opening it without saying a word. Thankfully, it was locked, and he spoke to me. "Hey, can you unlock the door? I need to bring a package inside." I felt sick to my stomach. This mailman was a big guy, and he looked really creepy. I told him he could just leave it on the porch, and he said back to me, No, I can't leave this package. It has expensive things inside. Just open up, and I'll be on my way." I didn't know what to say, and right after that my brother had walked into the living room after coming down the stairs, and walked across the room and into the kitchen with me. He stopped by the bowl of brownie mix and dipped his finger in, and said, "Where's Mom?" I looked past him to the kitchen door, and the man was gone. I got up and looked out the door. He didn't leave the box he was carrying. My brother thought nothing at all of this, but my mom was a little weirded out when she got home. I saw our mailman a couple days later, and it wasn't the same guy. Something I never realized at the time, but did when I got older, is how would the mailman know that there was expensive things inside our package? What would have happened if I had opened the door? Let me start off by saying I am female, and I am not a typical mail carrier. I was hired to deliver mail in the rural areas of a town I live close to. I don't walk door to door like most mail carriers you see. I usually just drive to each mailbox out here in the country, although every once in a while, I do have to leave my truck and carry mail to someone's door, usually because their mailbox has overgrown weeds surrounding it. The mailbox is rusted shut, or in some cases, they simply don't have one. Something creepy happened on my third day. I had parked my truck and started walking a long driveway to deliver the mail to a house. Their mailbox was completely surrounded by weeds and spider webs. It was raining, and I couldn't see very well because of my glasses. As I walked, I suddenly tripped on something and landed in a puddle. I couldn't believe I just did that, and I was soaked. I scrambled to my feet and looked around for what I tripped on. I didn't see anything. I was confused and pissed off. I bent down to pick up the mail I dropped, which was also now soaked. After gathering all of it, I started to jog over to the front door. I rang the doorbell and left the mail in front of the door. I turned around and started heading back down the long driveway. I was jogging, trying to get to my warm truck as fast as I could. As I got closer, I saw a man standing by the front of my truck, and when he saw that I noticed him, he ducked behind it, almost like a child would that was trying to hide from an adult. Right after that, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to look, and there was now 2 men standing on the porch watching me, the mail still sitting at their feet. The way they were just standing there, watching me leave, was so creepy for some reason. I made it to my truck and walked around it. The man that was there was not there anymore. I didn't feel safe. I got inside my truck and locked the door. I drove away and was freezing cold for the rest of the day due to falling in that stupid puddle. The next day, I pulled up to the same house. It wasn't raining this day, and I could see clearly as I began to walk the driveway. I stopped suddenly when I noticed a long, thin wire stretching across the driveway, right before the large puddle I had fell in the day before. I could not believe my eyes, and then I noticed a person crouched down behind the bushes next to the puddle. I immediately turned and started walking back to my truck. When I got there, I got inside and locked the door again and started to drive away. As I did this, I looked up the driveway and saw the man standing up now next to the puddle, and the same 2 men standing on the front porch. I had an argument with my boss later about switching routes permanently, as I didn't want to be close to that house ever again. He finally agreed, and I never did go there again, nor did I hear about anyone else ever having trouble delivering mail to that house.
When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. Basically, my mom packed her and I up one night, and we moved into my grandpa's and didn't look back. We ended up living there through my high school years. When he died, my parents officially got divorced. My mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, and the owners, an elderly couple who were family to us through marriage, lived on the second floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage out in the back where my uncle lived. For some reason that I will never understand, there was no lock to get into the actual building if you entered through the back. The back door opened into a landing where there was a locked and deadbolted door to our apartment, and then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the also locked and deadbolted door of the second floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement where there was also no lock. Our apartment could also be entered from the front of the building, but in order to access the second floor apartment or the basement, you had to go through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point they had started to convert it into its own apartment before they ultimately decided to make the in-law cottage instead. So in the basement, there was a full kitchen complete with an oven, a sink, and a refrigerator. The washer and dryer, which was shared by all of us, was also in the basement, as well as just some general storage stuff. The basement was entirely open except for a back room that was full of storage. It had one of those kind of swinging saloon-type doors where you can see above and beneath them. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see anything much behind the doors aside from shelves. You had to walk in them in turn to really see the room. One night, when I was in high school, I think I was 15 at the time, after taking a shower, I saw that the laundry bin in the bathroom was pretty full, so I grabbed a ton of laundry and headed down towards the basement. It was pretty late at night, but I figured I would at least get it started and move some things over in the morning. I tossed everything onto the ground and started sorting out colors when I got hit with a horrible feeling in my gut. The basement was not at all a creepy basement. It was well lit and pretty welcoming with the kitchen and everything, but for some reason that I can't explain, something just started to feel wrong. Anyone who has ever been hit with the feeling that they were being watched knows exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know how or why it came over me, but it was something that I couldn't shake, and I found myself looking over the saloon doors and the only part of the basement that I couldn't see in its entirety. I don't know why. Maybe just to assure myself I was being a big baby, I started to walk towards the back room, but stopped myself just as I reached out towards the swinging doors. I've been a horror fan for as long as I can remember, and had seen more horror movies than I could count, and I knew that if that was a movie, I would be calling myself a dumbass and saying not to go into that back room. I quickly snapped my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving all the clothes behind, and into our apartment, where I locked the doors and immediately told my mom that I just had the worst feeling in the basement and that I was super creeped out. Despite me not being the type of person that scares easily, she basically rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me a bit to shake the feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn any of the lights on as I started making my way towards the bathroom because it usually woke up my grandpa, and I didn't want to bother him. When I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom, and something looked off, and it took me a moment to realize that she was clutching the phone. She then noticed me and whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off and my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I could see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off of the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and the basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough that you could see that someone was outside of the door, but thick enough to not be able to make out any of the features of the person on the other side. But there was someone on the other side of the door, and every now and then the doorknob would move, and you could hear this scratching sound was on the other side. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else had taken control over me entirely. I slid down against the wall that I was clinging to and started to crawl against it in the darkness towards the kitchen. My mom looked petrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward, low and against the wall, towards the counter where I carefully grabbed a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time I moved, with the knife in my hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door the man was trying to get into. I had this horrible feeling that I was going to be killed, but if I wasn't going to go down without a fight. It felt like I sat there forever in the darkness, next to the door with my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me, just waiting. But it was only for a few minutes. My mom had already called 911 before I had woken up and stumbled my way towards the bathroom. The lights from approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door, I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion and the slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off running. It was around 3 a.m. when this happened, so it was completely dark outside, and we lived right by some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees that made it easy for the man to escape the cop that pursued him. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through almost the entire thing until the police came through to search the apartment and make sure that we were okay. The outside of the door and the doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife, trying to figure out how to get in. But that wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes that I had brought down were not where I had left them, and they had been thrown about and disheveled, and the back room, the one with the swinging door that I had stopped myself from going in, the boxes that were out of view had also been thrown about, all opened, obviously gone through, with some things missing, and there were some wrappers from food on the floor. He had been down there looking for something to steal. He was down there when I went down to do laundry. I had almost walked into that room, and based on what we had seen on the door, he had a knife. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what would have happened if I had walked into that room. My family used to drive to Tahoe around Christmas time when I was a kid. We would stay in this group of cabins that you could rent out for a weekend and go skiing and hiking. One year, I was walking through the forest with my sisters and my cousins, and we went much farther than we had ever gone, miles out into the wilderness. We never saw any animals, but eventually we came across a small shack, completely in the middle of nowhere, far into the deep woods. It was the creepiest thing we had ever seen, and we dared each other to go knock on the door, thinking that someone might be inside. This shack was no bigger than a porta-potty. I built up some courage, and two of my cousins and myself walked up to it. We knocked lightly on the door and then tried opening it. It was locked, and we could see that the doorknob had a hole for a key. And just before we were about to leave, I saw something on a tree, about 10 feet away from it. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a thumb nailed to the tree. We ran and never looked back. I was walking around the woods with some friends years ago when we nearly stumbled into a pit full of rattlesnakes. Obviously, we were mortified, but the scariest part of this was that we saw a small leg of some animal sticking out of the snakes. They all swirled together, and whatever the leg had belonged to was very dead. It was the most sickening, creepy thing I have ever seen. Just the thought of falling into a pit of snakes. Oh my God. Just down the road from me, I found a brick, ranch-style home. The lawn is quite large, and the land behind the lawn is cleared, except for strategically placed trees. There are close to 20 trees on this lot. There are about 10 dog houses placed under the trees. There are water bowls for the dogs, and there are, of course, the dogs. Except these dogs are not alive. They are large, stuffed animal dogs from a toy shop. The grass is cut and the lawn is well manicured. Months go by and seasons change. It rains and turns from summer to winter, and I can see from the road that those stuffed dogs stay out there getting weathered and eventually degrading. When the stuffed dogs become too worn, they are replaced by new stuffed animal dogs. I don't want to know why someone would do this. When I was 11, my brother and I asked our mother if we could go swimming down at the pool in our apartment complex. She hesitantly said that we could, and that she wanted us back home in 45 minutes. She gave us the key to access the pool area, and when we got there, we both ran and jumped in. We splashed around and wrestled in the shallow end. And then we saw that there was a woman sitting in the spa. The spa was on the other side of the pool, and we couldn't make out the woman very well. We could only tell that she was elderly. Then my brother noticed something else. He said that the water she was sitting in looked brown. I wasn't wearing my glasses and I couldn't see that far. My brother climbed out of the pool next to me, and as he looked over at the woman from where he was standing, I saw his face turn white. He started to cry as he tried to speak to me. I got out of the pool and stood next to him. The woman was staring in our direction, and the spa was a dark, dark red. We had to walk by her to exit the pool area, and didn't even notice her when we ran inside. We walked down the side of the pool, and it seemed like the woman was watching us as we walked. As we got closer, we saw that she wasn't watching us. She was dead, and the spa water was dark red from her blood. We ran home and told our mother, and she in turn called the police. The old woman had slit her wrists. When I was a kid, I found an abandoned elementary school in the middle of the woods. I found it when I was around 10 years old while exploring at my dad's hunting club in the backwoods of Alabama. The odd thing about it was that it didn't seem to have a road leading to it, or even a place to park cars, but everything inside was from the 60s and the 70s. It also seemed to be abandoned quickly. Books were still opened on the desks, shoes still in the cubbies, and papers still scattered around the rooms. I actually took a lot of the books that weren't weather damaged and brought them home with me. I remember asking my dad about it a few years later, and he knew about it, but said it gave him the creeps, so he never went near it. My dad left that hunting club a year later, so I never had the chance to check it out a second time. On a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other men doing a shakedown test cruise, planned to be out for about 12 hours. Mid-1980s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50-mile-per-hour range, just this short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the one fellow on board, who was the best sailor, sensed the storm was almost on us. Otherwise, we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a securite call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, but then it passed. We would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover, of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles or so in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things of the sea floor. The siding. We're all on deck, working lines, checking damage, etc., and the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, "The sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at the moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at the time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc., all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature. Take my word for it. The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D, skipper, or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked onto the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said that they had seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day and didn't speak of it again. One night, I was hanging out with my aunt and uncle when they randomly asked me if I believe in Bigfoot. I said, I do not, but I had an experience I certainly can't explain away. My buddy and I were passing through rural McKean County, Pennsylvania, in the Appalachian foothills after spending time in my family's hunting cabin in neighboring Potter County. I was telling my buddy about McKean County's main tourist draw, the Kinzua Bridge, once the world's tallest railroad bridge. Sadly, a few years ago the bridge was felled in the middle of the night by a tornado, ripping apart its midsection and leaving only the portions of the bridge anchored into the hillside standing. On the valley floor are rusted, contorted steel beams, some reaching dozens of feet into the air. Even though it was fast approaching midnight, my friend wanted to do some good old-fashioned trespassing to check it out. So did I. It being late at night and in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't a soul around. We hopped over their laughable security apparatus, a rented chain-link fence that wouldn't deter an 8-year-old. It's close to a full moon, and we're now 100 feet or so above the valley floor on what's left of the former monolith. We're doing the stupid, teenage, young 20s bullshit us guys do. Leaning over the edge where there used to be hundreds more feet of tracks, spitting off the edge, pissing off the edge. You know, all the prerequisites. After we grew bored of that, we began to rip off chunks of railroad ties. It was scary how easy it was to do this to something that had very recently had trains running on it. Naturally, the only course of action was to throw these huge chunks of wood off the bridge and make some noise. We chucked the chunks, and when it hit the ground, it made some noise. But oh my Lord God Jesus, the sound, the scream that came right after that will forever stick out in my mind. Outside of it being incredibly loud and urine-inducing, the best I can do is tell you, it sounded half primate and half industrial machinery, like metal screeching while hydraulics hiss. Then, whatever it is we spooked or pissed off starts sprinting away through the forest below. Mind you, it was a full moon, and at that hour we had good illumination. We could see sizable trees bending at absurd angles by something with an insane amount of size and strength. Even its footsteps made a ruckus among its primates like grunts. Sadly, we weren't lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the beast through the dense forest canopy. Listen, I've seen a handful of black bear running in the wild. None of them made anywhere near that much noise while sprinting away. I was fortunate enough to visit South Africa once and saw a rhino sprinting through the safari just a few feet away from our jeep. Again I say, a rhino sprinting didn't even come remotely close to making that much noise. Nothing compares. Whatever it was has to be colossal. When I got back to my home in central Ohio, I scoured the net for recording of bear and mountain lion calls. Nope, nothing sounded remotely like the scream we heard. I have yet to hear anything like it on the dozens of animal documentaries I've watched, or handful of remote camping trips. Once I concluded my story, my aunt and uncle jaws were on the floor. I asked them what was up. As it turns out, there was some Bigfoot show on at the time, and they had just seen an episode that took place at the Kinzua Bridge. I didn't even know about the show's existence, and had never seen or heard of the episode. Neither had my buddy. So again, I don't believe in Bigfoot. No authenticated print, droppings, or animal carcass. The odds of something of that alleged size not leaving a conclusive trace of evidence has to be next to impossible. Is it more likely my friend and I shared in a delusion? I guess that's more likely, but we were not tried, impaired, or scared until we heard that thing. In closing, everything I said is 100% what we experienced, and true. I'll never forget it. I want a rational explanation, but almost 10 years later, I've found absolutely nothing. Last summer, I heard about them. The black-eyed children were my favorite ghost story. And quite honestly, until last night, I thought that's exactly what they were. Most of the stories I've read take place in remote towns across the Midwest region of America. I live on the East Coast of America, so I figured I was safe from the phenomena happening to me. Most of the stories, for those that don't know, involve two children, usually an older girl and a little boy looking for help to get home. Sometimes the stories happen at night, sometimes early morning just before sunrise. My event happened at 1:04 a.m. Sunday, June 1st. I had been watching a science fiction double feature at my neighbor's house. It was me, and let's call them Zeke and Harry. His house is exactly a quarter-mile away, so I had walked over expecting to have some drinks and watch the movies. All in all, it was a successful night up to that point. After the movie ended, Zeke kicked Harry and I out, saying that he had a Tinder date in the morning and needed to rest. Harry and I left and started walking home together. Harry's house was in the middle of Zeke and my house. He offered me a cigarette, and I turned him down as we chatted about some of our respective year away at university. He offered me a ride home the rest of the way, but it was a decent night, so I turned him down. What was I thinking? As I got to the end of the street to the T intersection, I turned right to get to my house. I noticed a weird vibration in the air. It was making my fillings resonate in my mouth. It was pretty unpleasant, and that's when I saw the first pair. Coming out from behind the house directly ahead of me were two pale children. Goosebumps shot up my spine. At this point it was 1 a.m. and I was a little creeped out, so I decided to jog the rest of the way home. The closer I got to my house, the more children I saw. They were fucking everywhere, hundreds of them coming from every direction, all with strange black eyes. All of them were crying out for help. Help us, help us, help us. I ran as hard as I could to make it home. All the children were converging on me as I ran, and I had to dodge a couple of them from touching me. I struggled with my keys as I got to the door, and I could feel a small hand brushing the cloth of my shirt. As I ran inside and slammed the door behind me, I expected my parents and brother to come out and see what the commotion was, but no one did. I ran upstairs to wake them, but couldn't find anyone. I ran to my room, which was in the basement, glancing back outside to see a horde of children just standing staring at my house. Once I got to my room, I tried using my phone and laptop, but neither could connect to any network or got any sort of signal. I sat with my favorite knife, and I guess at some point, I fell asleep. I was awoken by my dad, who needed some help with yard work. He says he was asleep in bed with my mom all night and has told me several times to stop making up stories. I fear for tonight. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems. until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car. It shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves with watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight. It was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out, and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did, and the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us, and taunted us. The policeman took her claims seriously and told us of how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. This happened to me about 2 years ago, when I was on a cross-country road trip with my good friend Kim. We started in the Northwest, and our final destination was in Georgia. We were trying to make this trip as quickly as possible, and since it was just the two of us, we took shifts, sleeping and driving. We had just passed through Laramie, Wyoming, where I got pulled over for speeding. Not much, only 10 miles over the speed limit. I apologized to the police officer, and he kindly let us off the hook, since our car had no cruise control, and we had a long way to go ahead. After leaving Laramie, we didn't stop for a long time, and the highway rarely cut through any towns. It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and the highway was deserted. Tall pines lined the two-lane blacktop, and jagged mountains framed the starlit sky above. Kim was sleeping heavily, her chair reclined all the way down, a blanket thrown over her head. I had the radio on, but she was so exhausted, she paid no attention to it. I was trying to concentrate on the road and the quiet music on the radio to stay awake. Visibility was very limited, and there were no lights on this road. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I hastily looked at my speedometer, but I was diligently following the speed limit after the narrow escape from getting a ticket earlier. I pulled over, killed my engine, and rolled down my window. The cop car behind me appeared to be an unmarked vehicle, but it was hard to tell. Kim didn't stir as the police officer approached my window.
"Ma'am,"
he said in a Midwestern drawl,
"you know why I pulled you over today?"
"No, officer, I don't." His flashlight was pointed directly at my face, and I had to avert my eyes. I looked at the badge on his chest instead of his face.
"Your plates sure are from far away. Where are you headed?"
The police officer in Laramie had asked the same thing. "Georgia. Family emergency."
"Is that so? Well, miss, you aren't in any shape to make it to Georgia from Nebraska. No siree."
I frowned. Was my car breaking down? Taillights out? In my tired haze, had I missed something vital? "I'm sorry, what's wrong?"
"Here, miss, step out of the car. I can show you."
He gestured with his flashlight, and the beam slanted across Kim's blanket-shrouded face. She yawned. "What's going on?" The police officer abruptly turned, walked away, and got into his car. He flipped a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction down the highway. Kim and I stared at each other for a moment before I started the car, rolled up the window, and sped off, with no regard for the speed limit this time. I was driving in the backcountry roads of Maine with my two friends in 2012. We were on a short road trip, and it was the middle of the night. As we were driving, my friend saw something in the middle of the road. Whatever it was moving very slowly. We drove closer and stopped in front of it. It was a baby, crawling. All three of us got out of the car and ran over to it. It was a baby doll being pulled across the street by a string. We drove away from there as fast as his car would go. My friend Thomas and I had taken a road trip down to the beach, and we were on our way back home. The sun was setting as we drove, and we were sitting silently, listening to music. Suddenly, the front passenger's side tire popped, and we pulled over. We both got out and were looking at the tire. We were talking about what we should do, who we should call, etc., when out of nowhere, we see a guy off in the distance, on the same side of the road as us, walking in our direction. By now, the sun has almost completely set, and we can't make out this guy's features very well. He seemed to come from nowhere. There were no other cars in sight anywhere, and the road we were on was pretty barren. We stood there waiting for him to approach us, thinking that we would talk to him, but instead, we got in the car and sped off when we saw that he was holding a knife.
I was 10 years old and being wheeled into the hospital late at night. I remember seeing Christmas lights decorating the front of the hospital. Once I was inside, I remember the doctor telling my parents that I had pneumonia, and my mom started to cry. Those are the only things I remember about my visit, up until I was left alone on the first night. Everyone else in the rooms around me were sleeping, and so was I, until I heard something. I was facing the center of the room when I opened my eyes. I heard someone's shoes squeaking on the floor outside my room. I turned over and saw a nurse walk by, but she had walked out of my vision, past my window before I could see her face. About 2 seconds passed, and then I saw her walk by again. This is when my heart stopped beating, because of what exactly I saw. She was walking by at a very fast pace, and was looking directly at me through my window, in an exaggerated stare, meaning she was walking by, but had her head turned completely to the right side as she did, not able to see in front of her as she walked, and just staring at me. Very quickly, she was out of sight again. Then suddenly, she started walking by again, in the opposite direction. She was walking back and forth in front of my window. This time, her head turned completely to the left, again, staring into my eyes. She had brown hair that wasn't kept, and she looked insane. On this pass, I noted that her eyes were opened very wide. At this point, I thought my heart would explode because of how it was beating and how scared I was. Nobody else was in sight. When she walked out of my vision, a second later, she was walking by again. Every time, her head turned to the side, looking at me. I remember thinking, even at 10 years old, that something about her was very wrong. I didn't move a muscle, and could do nothing except just watch this incredibly scary woman walk back and forth in front of my window. One of the times that she walked by, she was smiling a huge, sickening smile that made tears well up in my eyes. Every time she walked by, she could not see what was in front of her, because the only thing she wanted to see was me, in my bed, through my window. It seemed like several minutes had passed, until finally, she did not walk by again. She simply walked by one last time, and then was gone. I sat there in bed and peered out my window, expecting her to walk by again at any moment, but she didn't. I must have stared out my window for the better part of an hour before my eyes got so heavy that I fell asleep. The next morning I awoke with my dad sitting in a chair next to my bed, reading a book. He smiled when he saw I was awake, and I told him what I saw before I fell asleep. He didn't seem to be scared by this, or even very alarmed. He asked me if I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was 100% sure then, and I'm 100% sure now. The woman was real. It happened, and she was wearing the same thing as every other nurse I saw. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and didn't see her again. This was told to me by an ex-boyfriend of mine about 5 years ago. I don't remember his exact words, but I do remember the gist of the tale. He lied to me many times, but I wasn't dating him for his intelligence. It seemed he believed this is what happened to him. As far as what actually happened, I don't know, and I'm not going to ask him. I just wanted to know if this is something he made up, or if someone else has experienced these creatures as well. From the smell and size, I immediately thought skunk ape, but after reading about the skunk ape, I decided against it. This happened circa 1995, probably spring, and I believe it was near a suburb southeast of Orlando. He said he lived at the last house in a cul-de-sac in a predominantly Cuban neighborhood. My ex, hereafter referred to as X, said this takes place in the woods near either an abandoned airport or mall. I think airport, but I can't remember precisely. He and 2 of his friends went into the woods there one night when they were in their early teens. I dare say they had beer and were looking for a private place to drink and shenanigize. They go deeper into the woods. X smells something first. Then his friends comment on it. It smells like garbage, he says. Absolutely reeks of garbage. A blob of black sludge drops on the front of X's shirt. It stinks. It is the vile aroma they had been detecting for several minutes now. In front of him drops a very tall, around 8-foot, thin creature with red eyes. It is covered in long, fine black hair. The way it lands, he said, was the most horrifying part. It landed without a sound. It landed on its feet from branches that had to be at least 10 feet in the air. It landed without disturbing the ground, like an illusion. They ran home. But that's not the end. Being an idiot, X decided to borrow his father's pistol, which of course was not secured in any meaningful way, and returned to the woods to kill these things before they had decided to come out of the woods and cause some kind of chaos. He did not know if they were aliens or demons, but he found both conditions offensive. He returned to the woods alone after dark. It wasn't long before he smelled the creature's stink, or before the same thing dropped down in front of him again 5 yards away. He raised the pistol and aimed to fire. The creature only stared at him. This is where I start to lose my suspension of disbelief. X suddenly feels that this thing is no threat. He lowers the pistol, and the creature takes off into the woods, and X gives chase. A quarter mile or so later, he chases the creature into a clearing where there are more of these things. There is a larger one in the center, standing with the one X was chasing. They appear to be in conversation. This larger one is more of a gray color and taller. They both look at X, and the gray one raises his long-fingered, bony hand towards the young boy. The small, black-haired one seems to say something to the gray one. X says the communication was not audible. The message is clear. It's all right. He won't hurt us. The gray-haired creature lowers his arm. At this point, outnumbered, X flees. He never went back into those woods, alone or otherwise. And that's the tale. I'm not sure if I believe it myself, but he swore it was true. I've told it to the best of my knowledge and memory, as well as refining his telling into something more readable. Has anyone else seen these things? This happened to me 4 years ago, in 2012. I was in the hospital, and for reasons I'd rather not share. It's not interesting anyway, but what is interesting is what happened one day while I was there. I woke up early one morning, before the sun came up, to see that another girl was now sharing the room with me. She wasn't there before. She was laying in her bed and appeared to be crying. For the longest time, I didn't say anything. I eventually did speak, and when I did, I said, "Hi, are you okay?" I realized that question was a dumb one, considering she was in the hospital, crying. She responded back and said she didn't feel good. I told her I was sorry and that I didn't feel good either. I asked her what was wrong, and she didn't respond. I told her my name was Katie and asked what hers was. She replied, "Julie." She continued to cry, and I just laid there, feeling bad for her, feeling helpless. I had fallen back to sleep, and when I woke up, she was gone. Which was weird as hell, I thought. That day, I was excited, because I was leaving after having been there a few days. I laid in bed and watched TV, until my sister and my mom eventually arrived and came in with a doctor and a nurse. They asked me how I felt, and my mom and sister hugged me, and I told everyone I felt great and was ready to leave. I got up and went to the restroom to change, and when I came out, I asked the doctor about the girl that was in my room earlier that morning, and he said he didn't know who she was or that there was another girl there, but that another doctor may have moved her to my room temporarily and then back out when another room became available. I shrugged, and on my way out of the room, I walked up to the nurse's station and asked the nurse who had been helping me for the past few days where the girl was that was in my room. She told me she had passed away. I was shocked and felt so bad. I asked when. The nurse said 6 days ago, and I was confused. I told her there was another girl in my room earlier that morning and asked what the girl's name was that had died. She responded to me and said,
that remain melodies of life.